Here's our scenario. We're going to be going through 9 iterations of development. And in the middle of the second iteration, or actually just prior to the second iteration, the Web Development Manager is going to make a decision that will have an impact on the total workflow within inside of the system. We don't want to do anything to accommodate for this decision, as we want to go ahead and let it self-play all the way out so we see what the ramifications are, short-term as well as long-term. So here we go. We're going to hit the Continue button. You're going to see that we're going to release 11 story cards into the system. And as we hit the Continue button, you're going to see that these 11 story cards are going to go through BA, Dev, Web Dev, but only 10 of them are going to get through QA because QA's capacity is only for 10 story cards. 1 story card is left inside of their queue or their backlog. This is a pretty healthy situation, and no problem here. But here we go into the beginning of the second iteration. The decision that the Web Development Manager made was to allow one of his developers to go off onto another project for 3 iterations. What that's done is reduced our capacity inside of web development from 12 story cards down to 6. So now our constraint has moved over to web development. Well, like I said earlier, we're not going to make any adjustments or accommodations for this because we want to allow this situation to play itself out. In other words, we are not going to tie the rope of our release of story cards into the system to our new capacity. We're going to go ahead and continue to put 11 story cards into the system. And it'll be pretty obvious what's going to happen. Of those 11 story cards, 6 of them are going to work their way through web development because that's what their capacity was. 5 are going to stay inside of their queue. And our total throughput for the iteration was 7. We had 1 in the QA queue prior to the iteration starting, plus the 7 that, or the 6 that worked their way through. So now we have a throughput of 7 stories for iteration 2. For iteration 3, I'm sure you can anticipate what's going to be happening here. The amount of story cards backlogged inside of web development has increased to 10. Our workflow has been reduced down to 6 now. We didn't have anything in the QA queue, and therefore we only were able to get 6 story cards done. We're going to play this for one more iteration, and as you'll see, we're now going to have 15 story cards backlogged inside of web development. And our velocity, once again, is just at 6. So what the web development's overall plan was they were going to have the 2 web developers work overtime when the second web developer came back onto the project, thinking that he'd be able to work his way back out of his backlog situation. So that's what's going to happen in iteration 5. You see that we now have 2 web developers, plus they're both working overtime. So our capacity for web development is now 18. So that capacity will be able to allow them to deal with 11 new story cards being introduced, plus work its way through the backlog that they have here. But notice what happens when we play this thing out. We're now starting to put backlog inside of QA. So even though we're starting to work our way through this backlog that we have here in web dev, we're starting to build up a backlog inside of QA. Also notice what else happened. The total amount of throughput that we had for the system was 10. Even though we do have some gains that are occurring inside of web development by having these guys work overtime, the total throughput on the system is still only throttled by what our capacity is based on our constraint. So as we play through the next iteration, you're going to see that essentially we've worked our way completely or nearly completely out of our backlog situation in web development, but look how many story cards we now have inside of QA. Now there's several things that could be done at this point, but again, we're not going to try to deal with this other than let itself play itself out to see what the long-term consequences are. So as we're playing iteration 7, I want you to watch what happens to some of the story cards in QA. We've stopped this iteration halfway through, and notice what's happened, that we've had 4 story cards that actually went backwards on our workflow. Those story cards that we had in QA actually had some defects in them, and so we had to put them back onto the developers to get those defects fixed. So what we want to do in lean manufacturing, or the principles of lean manufacturing, is we want to keep our work cycles as short as possible. What you want to do is as soon as QA finds a defect, you don't want to go ahead and put it back into a queue. You don't necessarily want to log it inside of an issue tracking system. You want it fixed, and you want it fixed right away. And so as QA is testing this, you should have the web developers and the developers right there with QA to see if it in fact does pass, and if it doesn't, kick it back to them right away to have them fix it rather than having them put it back into their queue. Now, one of the reasons why these went backwards is if you look at the color of these two stories, or these four stories, they're green and orange, which means they're iteration 5 and iteration 6 stories. That means these stories are pretty old. They've aged probably 2 iterations for the green ones and another iteration for the orange ones. So what's happened is these defects cannot be fixed right away because the developer hasn't looked at the code in quite a while. And so they're going to have to go sit in the queue, and what that's done is it's diminished the capacity of the developers for dealing with new story cards. So their capacity for dealing with new story cards has now been reduced to 8. And same thing with QA. Our capacity for QAing new stories is reduced to 8 because they are now going to have to re-QA these extra 4 stories. So we've reduced our total throughput in the system because we are now dealing with story cards that have aged a bit too long. And we'll see that the same problem happens again in iteration 8 where we have story cards working its way backwards. And as you can see, we're in iteration 8, but we're reworking stories from 2 iterations previously, and that's going to cause some problems in our performance. So we're going to go ahead and finish off the iteration 9, and you can see that we finished off iteration 9. We still have 15 stories with inside of QA that need to be worked, so that's going to take at least another iteration for us to get through this. So our total plan now is taking an extra iteration. In spite of the planning that the web development manager had of having his people work overtime, that did not cause us to gain anything with inside the system, and it actually caused the system to work even less effectively. So one of the things that we notice here is slippages in the system have accumulated. As you can see, we've had slippages where our total velocity has gone from 10 to 7 to 6 to 6, and those have accumulated. And any gains that we had in the system really didn't accumulate because of the constraint that we had in our system. And eventually, because our story cards became, the work cycle for those story cards were too long, when we had to go back and do some rework on those, they had to get put back in the queue. They couldn't be dealt with immediately, and that had another impact on our system. One of the other problems that we now see here is that QA is going to be still at full capacity for at least another iteration. We know that the BAs are freed up. The devs probably will be doing a little bit of rework, but the tendency that we're going to have now is to take this team of people that are sitting around idle waiting for these things to be QA'd and start them on another project. The problem with putting them on another project is they're going to be put on a project without having QA available because QA is going to still be working on the previous project. So you're going to continue the same problem that you have of not being able to get story cards through the system as quickly as possible because they will not be able to get to the QA queue because QA is still backlogged with stories from the previous project.